This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of loneliness no one notices because it wears lipstick, answers emails, remembers passwords, signs permission slips, sends thoughtful texts, and keeps the refrigerator stocked. It does not scream. It does not collapse in public. It does not make a scene. It pours coffee, folds laundry, leads meetings, pays bills, says I'm good, and somehow keeps life moving with both hands while something nameless goes missing in the background. That is the loneliness I want to begin with. Not the obvious kind. Not the kind people rush to comfort. I mean the hidden kind. The kind that lives inside women who are admired for being capable. Women who look grounded, polished, composed. Women who know how to keep their voice calm even when their chest feels tight. Women who have spent so many years being reliable that no one thinks to ask whether they still feel alive inside their own lives. And maybe the most unsettling part is this: sometimes I do not notice it either. Not right away. Because from the outside, my life can look completely fine. Respectable, even. I can have a career, routines, friendships, responsibilities, a marriage, or the memory of one. I can have children, grown children, no children, a home that is quiet by 9 p.m., a gym membership I use often enough to call it a habit, and a face that still knows how to look calm when the world expects calm from me. I can be the woman everyone depends on. The woman who gets things done. The woman who keeps herself together. But there are nights when the house goes still, and the silence feels less like peace and more like exposure. There are nights when I sit at the edge of my bed, or stand at the kitchen counter under one soft light, and feel something I cannot explain in neat language. Not devastation. Not dramatic unhappiness. Something harder to name than that. A quiet displacement. A feeling that I have become efficient at living and strangely absent from the life I am living. That is where this story begins. It begins with a woman who has not fallen apart, which is exactly why no one sees she is slipping away from herself. It begins with a woman who still shows up, still performs, still manages, still smiles at the right moments, and yet feels unaccompanied in the most intimate place possible, inside her own inner world. That kind of pain is difficult to confess because it sounds ungrateful. It sounds vague. It sounds like the kind of thing a strong woman should be able to fix quietly and move on from. So instead, many of us carry it privately. We call it stress. Hormones. A phase. A busy season. We tell ourselves we just need a weekend away, a better routine, a cleaner diet, a little more discipline, maybe a break from our phones. But what if that is not the real problem? What if the ache is not coming from a lack of productivity or a lack of gratitude, but from something much more intimate and much more frightening? What if I have spent years being present for everyone except myself? That is the question underneath all of this. And once that question enters the room, it changes everything. Because then I have to face a possibility that is both devastating and clarifying. I may have built a very functional life while quietly losing the relationship I have with myself. I may know exactly how to care for other people, respond to pressure, maintain appearances, and survive disappointment, but not know how to return to myself when I feel afraid, unwanted, unseen, emotionally hungry, or quietly overwhelmed. That realization can shake a woman to her core. Not because she is weak, but because she has been strong in all the wrong directions for too long. If this channel speaks to you, subscribe now and stay with me. This space is being built for women who do not need more noise, more clichés, or more empty motivation. I want to make videos that feel like company in the dark, language for things people rarely say out loud, and truth that helps you feel less alone in your own life. If that is the kind of space you have been looking for, subscribe and be part of this with me. There is a kind of woman the world praises too early. The dependable girl. The mature daughter. The calm wife. The understanding friend. The mother who can handle everything. The woman who does not ask for much. The woman who adapts. The woman who is emotionally intelligent enough to read the room before anyone else notices the shift in temperature. She is called strong so many times that eventually she mistakes self-abandonment for character. She becomes excellent at anticipating needs, smoothing tension, staying pleasant, staying composed, staying useful. She learns how to manage discomfort without naming it. How to keep going without examining the cost. How to swallow longing before it becomes inconvenient. How to survive by becoming deeply available to everyone else. And one day, she wakes up and realizes she does not know how to be deeply available to herself. This is where so many women live, especially the ones no one worries about. The women who look fine on the outside are often the very women carrying the heaviest invisible weight. Because high-functioning pain is difficult to detect. It hides inside good manners, good work ethic, good parenting, good taste, and good timing. It hides inside beautifully organized calendars and carefully worded texts. It hides inside women who know exactly how to remain composed while something inside them quietly asks, "When do I get to stop holding everything together?" Sometimes anxious attachment looks like obvious panic. But often, in grown women, it looks far more refined than that. It looks like reading too much into a pause in someone's voice. It looks like replaying a conversation on the drive home. It looks like noticing emotional distance before anyone says a word. It looks like performing calm while feeling a storm gather under the skin. It looks like centering an entire evening around whether one person seems warm, cold, close, distracted, tender, unavailable, or changed. And maybe the most painful part is that I can do all of this while still appearing completely normal. That is what makes it so lonely. No one sees the mental labor. No one sees how much of my energy is spent monitoring, adjusting, interpreting, bracing. No one sees how often I am not actually resting, only pausing between responsibilities. No one sees how many women are living with a constant low hum of emotional vigilance and calling it love, maturity, sensitivity, or just how life is. But it is not just how life is. There is a difference between being responsible and being rooted. Responsibility says I will keep everything moving. Rootedness says I will not disappear while I do. Many women have mastered the first and never been taught the second. That is why a woman can have a full life and still feel hollow in certain quiet moments. She can have people around her and still feel emotionally unsheltered. She can be loved, admired, needed, and still feel strangely untethered from herself. Because being needed is not the same as being known. Being admired is not the same as being held. Being chosen is not the same as being safe. And if I have spent enough years confusing those things, I may not even realize how tired I am until the room goes quiet enough for the truth to become audible. That truth can sound like this. I am here, but I am not fully with myself. I am functioning, but I am not deeply anchored. I am loved in certain ways, but I do not know if I know how to love my own inner life well. I have become excellent at enduring what I should have learned to question. I have spent years tending to the world around me while the woman within me waits, patiently, painfully, to be noticed. That is not failure. That is the beginning of awakening. And that is why this conversation matters. Because building a relationship with myself is not some soft luxury for women with extra time. It is not a trendy wellness concept. It is not about becoming self-obsessed, perfectly healed, or endlessly confident. It is about something far more urgent than that. It is about what happens when I can no longer afford to be a stranger in my own life. It is about the moment I realize that what looks fine on the outside may be costing me something sacred on the inside. It is about the woman who has carried everybody else so gracefully that she forgot what it feels like to be carried by her own presence. And if that woman is me, then I do not need another performance. I need the truth. I need language for the quiet ache. I need honesty about the hidden exhaustion. I need to understand how a woman can look stable, accomplished, kind, reasonable, and still feel lost in a way no one around her can quite see. Because once I understand that, I can begin to understand something even more important. How to come back. What anxious attachment actually feels like in a grown woman's life. Anxious attachment in a grown woman's life rarely looks the way people imagine it. It is not always dramatic. It is not always loud. It is not always the desperate phone call, the visible unraveling, the obvious plea to be loved better. By the time I am older, by the time I have lived enough life to know how to behave in public, how to stay composed, how to keep a decent face on even when I am hurting, anxious attachment often becomes much more refined than that. It becomes private. It becomes intelligent. It becomes almost impossible for other people to see. From the outside, I may look like a woman with perspective. A woman who understands nuance. A woman who does not overreact. A woman who gives people grace. A woman who knows relationships are complicated. A woman who has enough maturity not to make everything about herself. And yet, inside that polished exterior, something far less peaceful can be happening. I can be living in a constant state of emotional interpretation. I can be reading tone, pauses, silence, timing, wording, energy, eye contact, distance, warmth, withdrawal. I can be gathering tiny fragments and trying to build certainty out of them because uncertainty feels unbearable in ways I do not always know how to explain. That is what makes it so exhausting. It is not only the fear of losing someone. It is the labor of never fully relaxing around the possibility. Anxious attachment in adulthood often feels like living with an invisible alarm system that is too sensitive for the life I am actually living. It goes off at changes that seem small to everyone else. A message sounds shorter than usual. A plan feels less enthusiastic. A pause lingers where warmth used to be. A partner is distracted. A friend becomes distant. A family member pulls away. A boss grows cooler. Someone I care about becomes harder to read, and suddenly my entire body reacts as if something significant is at risk. That reaction is not just mental. It is physical. My chest tightens. My stomach drops. My mind becomes sharp in all the wrong places. I cannot fully settle into the moment I am in because some part of me has already started searching for what changed and what it means. I can be standing in my kitchen, folding towels, answering work emails, making dinner, driving to an appointment, and meanwhile half of my energy is elsewhere, trying to solve an emotional equation no one handed me directly. That is one of the strangest parts of anxious attachment in a grown woman's life. I can still function while I am activated. I can keep going while I am quietly unraveling. I can attend the dinner, host the meeting, return the call, smile at the neighbor, and inside myself be completely preoccupied by whether someone feels close or far from me. I may not fall apart in visible ways. I may simply disappear inward. My body remains present, but my attention leaves the room. It is difficult to describe this to people who have never lived it because it can sound so disproportionate. Even to me, it can feel embarrassing. I may know that a delayed response should not carry this much emotional weight. I may understand, intellectually, that adults get busy, moods change, people withdraw for reasons that are not always about me. I may know all of that and still feel my entire nervous system react as though the floor has shifted beneath me. That gap between what I know and what I feel can become its own source of shame. And shame is one of the cruelest layers of anxious attachment. Because it is not just that I feel affected. It is that I judge myself for being affected. I can want reassurance and then immediately feel weak for needing it. I can ache for closeness and then feel humiliated by the ache. I can crave tenderness and then despise the part of me that seems to care too much. So the experience becomes doubled. There is the original pain of feeling uncertain, and then there is the secondary pain of believing I should be above it by now. That second pain often keeps women silent. By adulthood, many of us have learned to make our distress socially acceptable. We do not always ask directly for what we need. We become careful instead. We become strategic. We pretend to be less affected than we are. We tell ourselves to stay calm, act normal, do not push, do not say too much, do not reveal too much need, do not make the relationship heavier than it already feels. So we manage ourselves outwardly while inwardly becoming more and more consumed. We do not want to seem difficult. We do not want to be the woman who needs too much. We do not want to become inconvenient to love. That is why anxious attachment in grown women can look so quiet on the surface and so violent underneath. It can look like rereading a text 5 times to detect a shift in tone that may or may not exist. It can look like replaying a conversation on the drive home, not because the conversation was catastrophic, but because one sentence landed strangely and I cannot let it go. It can look like changing the entire mood of my day because someone I care about feels emotionally unavailable for reasons I have not even confirmed. It can look like trying to sound measured while my body is begging for certainty. It can look like lying awake beside someone, married to them, committed to them, living a whole life with them, and still feeling emotionally alone in a way I do not know how to explain without sounding disloyal. And it does not only live in romance. That is important to say clearly, because anxious attachment can thread itself through every relational space that still touches old vulnerability. It can surface in friendships when I sense withdrawal and begin asking myself what I did wrong. It can surface in family dynamics where I still become the pleasing version of myself without even realizing it. It can surface at work when authority figures carry more emotional charge than they should. It can surface after divorce, after betrayal, after abandonment, after caregiving fatigue, after years of being the one who held everything together while no one asked what holding it all was costing me. At this age, the pattern is often less about obvious dependency and more about emotional hypervigilance. I become the woman who can sense the shift before anyone names it. The woman who notices. The woman who absorbs. The woman who remains tuned to the emotional weather of everyone around her because some deep part of her still believes that connection must be monitored in order to remain safe. That kind of vigilance drains life from ordinary moments. It steals presence. It steals appetite. It steals delight. It makes rest difficult because rest requires trust, and anxious attachment does not trust stillness easily. Stillness leaves space for fear to speak. So even when life is technically calm, I may not feel calm. I may feel suspended, waiting for the next sign, the next tone change, the next withdrawal, the next proof that I should have braced more carefully. And because so many women are high-functioning, this can go unnoticed for years. People call it sensitivity, thoughtfulness, depth, strong intuition. Sometimes it is those things. But sometimes it is simply a nervous system that has never fully learned the difference between genuine danger and emotional inconsistency. That distinction matters. Because if I do not understand what anxious attachment actually feels like in a grown woman's life, I may keep misnaming it. I may call it love when it is fear. I may call it intuition when it is panic moving through a mature vocabulary. I may call it patience when it is self-erasure. I may call it overthinking when in truth it is a body trying desperately to secure safety through prediction. The saddest part is that I can build an entire life around managing this pattern without ever truly feeling free of it. I can become wiser, more spiritual, more articulate, more productive, more self-aware, and still find myself undone by the familiar ache of emotional uncertainty. That is why this part of the story matters. Not so I can judge myself more accurately, but so I can finally name what has been silently running in the background. Because once I can name it, I begin to understand that what I have been experiencing is not weakness. It is not childishness. It is not proof that I am too much to love. It is a deeply human pattern that has followed me into adulthood and learned how to speak in more sophisticated ways. And if I can see it clearly, I can stop confusing the pattern for my personality. Why I lose myself, the old survival skills I still call love. I do not lose myself all at once. I lose myself in ways that once kept me safe. That is what makes this part so difficult to face with honesty. If the patterns were obviously destructive from the beginning, I might have rejected them sooner. But many of the ways I learned to survive were rewarded. They made me lovable. They made me easier to manage. They made me appear mature, thoughtful, sensitive, accommodating, emotionally intelligent. They made me the kind of woman other people could depend on. And when a survival skill is praised long enough, it stops feeling like a strategy and starts feeling like identity. So when I ask why I lose myself, the answer is rarely simple. It is not because I do not care about myself. It is not because I am weak. It is not because I enjoy suffering. It is because some of the very traits that helped me move safely through earlier relationships became the same traits that now pull me away from myself in adult life. I may have learned very early that love was not something I could simply relax into. Love had weather. It had conditions. It had moods I needed to track. It had silences I needed to interpret, disappointments I needed to avoid, emotional temperatures I needed to feel before they were spoken aloud. Maybe nobody explained this to me directly. Maybe no one had to. Children learn quickly what keeps connection intact. Children become fluent in emotional climates long before they have language for what they are doing. So I learned. I learned how to read faces. I learned how to soften my tone. I learned how to stay agreeable. I learned how to become low maintenance. I learned how to anticipate needs before they became demands. I learned how to be useful. I learned how to be impressive. I learned how to be the easy one, the strong one, the understanding one, the one who did not need too much, the one who could absorb more than she should. At the time, these were not flaws. They were intelligent adaptations. They helped me stay connected in environments where emotional safety may have been inconsistent, narrow, or dependent on how well I managed myself. They helped me avoid conflict. They helped me maintain closeness. They helped me feel chosen. And for a child, being chosen is not a small thing. It can feel like survival. That is why some of the patterns I now struggle with are so hard to release. They are not random habits. They were once part of the architecture of safety. Even now, in adulthood, some part of me still reaches for them as if they are holy. As if this is what love asks of me. Adjust more. Explain better. Be kinder. Be more patient. Need less. Stay soft. Stay available. Make room. Understand where they are coming from. Try again. Hold the bond together. And because these behaviors can look so beautiful from the outside, I may never question them deeply enough. I may call them generosity when they are actually fear. I may call them maturity when they are really hypervigilance in elegant clothing. I may call them loyalty when, underneath, they are an old terror of what happens when connection becomes uncertain. This is where so many women get lost. Not in obvious chaos, but in patterns that feel noble. I can spend years believing I am simply loving well when in truth I am overfunctioning in order to keep myself emotionally safe. I can believe I am being compassionate when I am actually abandoning my own instincts. I can believe I am being patient when I am staying too long in confusion because confusion is still more familiar than clear disappointment. There is a grief in realizing that what I have called love may have been, at least in part, self-erasure. Not all of it. I do not want to flatten human love into pathology. Some of what I have given has been real tenderness, real devotion, real care. But mixed into that, there may have been older movements too. A need to secure, soothe, preserve, or earn love by becoming the version of myself least likely to be left. And that changes the emotional quality of everything. Because then I am not only loving, I am negotiating for safety. That negotiation is exhausting. It lives in the split second before I tell the truth and decide instead to make it more palatable. It lives in the smile I offer when I am actually hurt. It lives in the extra grace I extend because I am afraid clarity will cost me closeness. It lives in how quickly I reach for empathy toward other people and how slowly I offer that same empathy inward, toward myself. Some women grew up in overtly difficult homes. Others grew up in homes that looked perfectly respectable from the outside and still left them emotionally underfed. That is one of the hardest truths to speak because it feels disloyal. It feels ungrateful. But a woman can come from a decent family and still learn that her inner world is only welcome in certain forms. She can be loved and still not feel emotionally safe. She can be cared for and still feel that her sadness, anger, confusion, or needs are somehow too inconvenient, too dramatic, too messy, too much. So she becomes manageable. She becomes the daughter who does not add pressure. The woman who senses what everyone needs before they ask. The partner who absorbs more than she should because she has mistaken tolerance for love. The friend who listens beautifully and says little about what she herself is carrying. And because the world often rewards women for exactly these adaptations, it can take years to understand the cost. The cost is not always obvious in the beginning. At first, these survival skills can look like success. They help me maintain relationships. They help me avoid rupture. They help me stay chosen. But slowly, quietly, they begin to hollow something out. I become so skilled at preserving connection that I stop noticing what the preservation is requiring of me. I stop noticing how often I betray my own body to remain emotionally available. I stop noticing how rarely I ask the more dangerous question, what is this doing to me? That question is dangerous because once I ask it honestly, I cannot unhear the answer. Maybe what this is doing to me is making me smaller. Maybe it is teaching me to doubt my own perception. Maybe it is making me feel lonely in relationships that are technically still intact. Maybe it is keeping me emotionally dependent on scraps of reassurance. Maybe it is convincing me that love is something I must maintain through effort rather than receive through mutuality. And if that is true, then I have to face another hard truth. Some of the old survival skills I still call love are no longer protecting me. They are costing me. That can feel disorienting because these patterns may be woven into my character so tightly that I do not know where one ends and the other begins. If I am not the understanding one, then who am I? If I stop smoothing everything over, who will I become? If I tell the truth instead of preserving comfort, what happens to the identity I built around being easy to love? These are not small questions. They reach deep into a woman's sense of self. Especially in midlife, when roles begin to crack and old identities no longer fit as cleanly as they once did, I may start to see just how much of my life has been shaped by emotional adaptation. I may realize that I have not only been trying to love, I have been trying to prevent the pain of not being loved enough. I have been trying to outrun abandonment by becoming indispensable, desirable, reasonable, forgiving, low maintenance, endlessly understanding. But no amount of self-editing can create real safety where mutual care is missing. That is the heartbreak beneath this section. I can do everything right according to my old survival system and still not get the kind of love that lets me rest. I can be impressive, patient, generous, beautiful, capable, sexually available, emotionally perceptive, and still end up with the same ache. Because the ache was never only about performance. It was about the deeper belief that I had to earn what should have been freely given. And that belief does not stay neatly contained inside romance. It spills into work, family, friendship, motherhood, even the relationship I have with my own body. I begin to approach everything with the same hidden question: what do I have to do to remain secure here? How do I keep this from slipping away? How do I make myself easier to keep? When a woman lives too long inside that question, she starts to disappear. Not dramatically. Gradually. She disappears in the compromises no one sees. In the truths she withholds from herself. In the ways she keeps translating her pain into something more acceptable. In the loyalty she gives to roles and relationships that do not fully hold her. In the reflex to understand everyone else before she has even paused to understand what she feels. That is why I lose myself. Not because I do not exist. Not because I do not matter. But because I learned to survive by placing connection above self-contact. I learned to scan outward before I looked inward. I learned to protect the bond before I protected my own inner life. And now, as a grown woman, I have to decide whether I want to keep living by those rules. That decision is not clean. It is not easy. There is grief in it. Because even harmful strategies were once forms of protection. They deserve respect before they are released. I do not want to shame the woman I had to be. She was trying to get through life with the tools she had. She was trying to stay loved in the only ways she understood. But I cannot keep calling every adaptation love just because it once helped me survive. At some point, adulthood asks more of me than survival. It asks for truth. It asks whether the patterns that once kept me close to others have also taken me far away from myself. It asks whether I am willing to stop confusing emotional labor with intimacy, over-accommodation with devotion, self-silencing with grace. And perhaps most painfully, it asks whether I am willing to believe that real love does not require my disappearance. The quiet ways I leave myself every day. I do not leave myself in dramatic ways most of the time. I leave myself quietly, so quietly that I can go through an entire day without realizing I have been absent from my own life. That is what makes this kind of self-abandonment so difficult to catch. If it were obvious, if it arrived like a visible collapse or a reckless decision that everyone around me could name, I might have noticed it sooner. But the ways I leave myself are often small, polished, socially acceptable. They hide inside ordinary routines, decent manners, productivity, responsiveness, and the endless little adjustments that keep life looking smooth from the outside. I leave myself first thing in the morning when I reach for my phone before I have even heard my own thoughts. Before I have felt the shape of my own mind, I am already entering other people's voices, other people's needs, other people's moods, other people's news. A message, an email, a headline, a reminder, a calendar notification, a social feed, some glimpse into someone else's life. It all seems harmless because it is normal. But there is something quietly violent about becoming instantly available to the world before becoming present to myself. By the time I finally pause, I am no longer starting from center. I am starting from reaction. I leave myself when I say yes too quickly. That quick yes has many disguises. It sounds like politeness. It sounds like flexibility. It sounds like being easygoing, generous, understanding. But often it is fear moving faster than truth. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of seeming difficult. Fear of creating tension. Fear of what might happen if I let a pause exist long enough for my real answer to rise. So I answer before I know. I commit before I have checked in. I offer time, energy, access, softness, labor, attention, and understanding from a place that has not been consulted. That is one of the ways I disappear. Not because anyone forces me to, but because I have learned how to leave myself before anyone else has the chance. I leave myself when I keep narrating someone else's behavior instead of listening to my own internal state. A shift in tone, a colder response, a pause in warmth, a strange look, a distracted evening, and suddenly my attention moves away from me and locks onto the other person. What did that mean? Why did they say it that way? Are they upset? Are they pulling away? Did I do something wrong? Should I ask? Should I wait? Should I smooth it over? My mind becomes busy with interpretation, and in that busyness I lose contact with the more important question: what is happening inside me right now? This is one of the quietest betrayals. I can spend hours monitoring another person's behavior and never once ask what the moment is costing me. I can become so skilled at reading the room that I stop reading myself. I leave myself when I explain away what my body already knows. The fatigue I call laziness. The irritation I call overreacting. The heaviness I call a bad mood. The tightness in my chest I call stress. The truth is often simpler and harder than that. Sometimes my body is telling me that I am overstimulated, overextended, emotionally flooded, underrested, underfed, touched out, heart-tired, or carrying a truth I have not yet let become language. But instead of listening, I override. I keep going. I become efficient at functioning through signals that should have been taken seriously. A woman can spend years doing this and call it resilience. I leave myself when I stay in conversations that are draining me because I do not want to seem rude. I stay on the phone too long. I keep listening after my spirit has gone numb. I let someone repeat the same self-absorbed monologue while my own nervous system quietly curls inward. I tolerate sarcasm that lands like contempt. I accept emotional crumbs dressed up as effort. I keep offering warmth where there is very little mutuality. And because none of this looks dramatic, I tell myself it is fine. I tell myself I am being kind. But there is a point where staying open is no longer generosity. It is self-abandonment with good manners. I leave myself through consumption. Not always in extreme ways. Often in ordinary, almost invisible ones. A little more scrolling when I already feel detached from my own day. A little more online shopping when I need comfort but do not know how to ask for it. A little more wine because the evening feels too exposed in its quiet. A little more television because I do not want to sit in the room with my own thoughts. A little more snacking not from hunger but from emotional static. None of this makes me weak. It makes me human. But I have to be honest about what is happening in those moments. I am not always indulging. Sometimes I am leaving. I leave myself through busyness too. Busyness is one of the most respected forms of self-abandonment because it earns admiration. It looks responsible, productive, necessary. Especially for women, being overextended can look like devotion. But there is a difference between a full life and a crowded escape. Sometimes I stay in motion because stillness would force me into contact with what I feel. Stillness might reveal loneliness, grief, resentment, or the slow ache of realizing how little of my life actually feels like mine. So I keep moving. I clean, answer, plan, volunteer, arrange, fix, organize, improve. I make movement feel virtuous so I do not have to ask whether it is also protective. I leave myself when I perform being fine long after I know I am not. This may be one of the most painful ways. The casual I'm okay that costs me something each time I say it. The smile I wear because I do not want to explain. The calm tone I use when my inner world is anything but calm. The polished answer that protects other people from the truth of what I am carrying. It is not that every feeling needs an audience. It is that if I am never truthful anywhere, I slowly become unreachable even to myself. And then there are the smaller daily exits that seem harmless until I add them up. ignoring my own hunger because I am too distracted, pushing through exhaustion because there is one more thing to do, postponing a walk that would help me because someone else needs something, staying up too late because the night is the only time that feels like mine, consuming everyone else's thoughts before I have had one of my own, living in low-grade emotional accessibility all day long, then wondering why I feel depleted, irritable, far away from myself. This is how resentment begins too. Not always because the people around me are monstrous, but because I keep participating in my own depletion. I keep saying yes where I mean not now. I keep staying where I feel myself shrinking. I keep offering understanding where I need boundaries. I keep making my own limits negotiable. Resentment often enters where self-loyalty has quietly eroded. What makes all of this so difficult is that none of it looks catastrophic. It looks normal. It looks feminine, even. It looks like adulthood. It looks like care. It looks like being a good partner, a good friend, a good mother, a good colleague, a good woman. And that is why so many women do not recognize how often they are leaving themselves. The exits have been woven into the fabric of daily life. But if I am honest, there is one pattern beneath all the others. The deepest sign that I do not yet have a strong relationship with myself is this: when something hurts, I move away from myself first. I do not stay long enough to hear what the hurt is asking for. I go into management, interpretation, distraction, accommodation, numbing, performance, productivity, pleasing, consumption, overthinking, silence. I leave through whatever door is most available. That is the truth beneath the polished life. Not that I do not care about myself, but that I have become too practiced at departure. And maybe healing begins less with grand transformation than with noticing the exits in real time. The moment my hand goes to the phone. The moment the yes comes before the pause. The moment I start narrating someone else instead of listening inward. The moment my body says enough and I call it weakness. The moment I know I am no longer present to myself. Because that moment matters. That moment is where return becomes possible. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But honestly. And honesty, in a woman's daily life, is often where coming back begins. What it really means to build a relationship with myself. To build a relationship with myself is not as simple as learning how to be alone without feeling restless. It is not just about taking myself to dinner, buying flowers, writing affirmations in a journal, or creating a life that looks peaceful from the outside. Those things can be lovely. They can soften a day. They can remind me I exist. But they are not, by themselves, the substance of what I am reaching for. A real relationship with myself is something far less performative and far more demanding than the language of self-care usually allows. It is not built through image. It is built through contact, through honesty, through repetition, through the quiet decision to stop treating my own inner life like an afterthought. When I say I want a relationship with myself, I mean I want to become someone I do not abandon the moment things get emotionally inconvenient. I want to become someone who can stay. Someone who can hear what I feel before trying to fix how it looks. Someone who can tell the truth to herself before translating it into something more acceptable, more polished, more digestible. I want to stop being a woman who is endlessly available to everyone else while remaining strangely unavailable to her own reality. That kind of relationship is not built on mood. It is built the same way any meaningful relationship is built, through trust, consistency, listening, repair, and the willingness to remain present when things are not easy. That is the part many women miss because we often imagine self-relationship as something warm and gentle, and of course it can be. But tenderness without truth is not intimacy. Comfort without honesty is not connection. I can soothe myself, indulge myself, distract myself, even praise myself, and still not actually be in relationship with myself if I am unwilling to face what is real. To have a relationship with myself means I know how to listen when something in me tightens. I know how to ask what that tightening is trying to say before I label it an overreaction. I know how to notice when my exhaustion is not just physical, but emotional. I know how to recognize when I am trying to force myself through what should have been grieved, questioned, or left. It means I stop reducing my own interior world to a series of inconveniences I need to manage more efficiently. That is what changes first. The quality of attention I give myself. Many women have spent years trying to improve themselves without ever truly accompanying themselves. We know how to work on ourselves. We know how to discipline ourselves, optimize ourselves, fix our habits, refine our appearance, become more informed, more spiritual, more productive, more emotionally aware. But accompaniment is something else entirely. It asks, when I am hurting, do I know how to remain close to myself? When I am ashamed, do I turn against myself or toward myself? When I am confused, do I betray what I know in order to keep the peace? When I am lonely, do I know the difference between needing comfort and needing truth? A relationship with myself requires that I stop treating my own feelings like courtroom evidence. I do not need every emotion to be justified before it deserves attention. I do not need a perfect explanation for why something hurt. I do not need to argue myself out of what my body already knows. I need to become trustworthy enough that when something in me says this does not feel right, I pause. I listen. I let that inner voice have weight. That is what self-trust really is. Not arrogance. Not endless certainty. Not the fantasy that I will always know exactly what to do. Self-trust is much quieter than that. It is the belief that I will not lie to myself for the sake of convenience. It is the belief that if I feel afraid, or tender, or thrown off, I will not instantly hand myself over to panic, performance, or someone else's interpretation of who I am. I will stay in contact with myself long enough to hear what is true. That kind of trust is not built by thinking highly of myself. It is built by being reliable to myself. I become reliable to myself when I keep the boundary I said mattered. When I admit I am more hurt than I wanted to be. When I stop calling confusion chemistry. When I stop making my body carry truths my mouth is afraid to speak. When I notice I am reaching for another person to regulate me and ask whether there is a way to come back to myself first. When I tell myself the truth about what a relationship, a room, a role, a friendship, a habit, or a silence is actually doing to me. This is why building a relationship with myself is not the same thing as building self-esteem. Self-esteem can rise and fall with performance, appearance, success, approval, or the season of life I am in. A relationship with myself asks for something deeper than confidence. It asks for intimacy. And intimacy with myself means I am no longer a stranger to my own patterns. I know what drains me. I know what seduces me when I am emotionally hungry. I know what I tend to romanticize when I am lonely. I know what kinds of attention make me feel chosen but not safe. I know how I sound when I am abandoning myself. I know the difference between the part of me that wants relief and the part of me that wants real peace. I know the stories I tell when I am afraid. I know how quickly I can start making meaning out of someone else's silence. I know where I still become small. That knowing is not meant to make me hyper-aware in a punishing way. It is meant to make me intimate with myself in a compassionate one. Because what is intimacy, really, if not a form of patient knowing? A relationship with myself means I become willing to know the less flattering parts without withdrawing love from them. The part of me that still longs to be chosen. The part of me that still gets triggered by distance. The part of me that still confuses being needed with being secure. The part of me that still wants to be reassured before she can exhale. These parts do not disappear just because I become more self-aware. But my relationship to them changes. I stop letting them run the house without supervision, and I stop treating them like enemies. I begin to meet them with steadiness rather than shame. That is how real inner closeness forms. It also means I stop negotiating against my own well-being. This is one of the most adult forms of love I can offer myself. Not indulgence. Not sentimentality. But refusal. Refusal to keep betraying what I know. Refusal to keep explaining away what hurts. Refusal to keep calling myself needy for having human needs. Refusal to keep pretending that because I can endure something, I should. There is a profound difference between being able to survive a dynamic and being well inside it. A woman with a relationship to herself begins to care about that difference. She no longer uses endurance as proof that something is acceptable. She begins to ask better questions. Not just, can I handle this, but what is this asking me to become? Not just, can I make this work, but what is this costing me internally? Not just, do they want me, but do I feel at home with myself here? That last question changes everything. Because when I feel at home with myself, I move differently. I do not chase as quickly. I do not explain as much. I do not confuse intensity with meaning. I do not hand over authority so easily. I become more discerning, not colder. More honest, not harsher. More grounded, not less loving. I can still desire, still hope, still care deeply, but I do so with myself still present in the room. That is what I think many women are actually hungry for. Not another polished version of self-love, but a deeper inhabiting of themselves. A place inside where they are no longer always auditioning, always translating, always bracing, always abandoning, always waiting for someone else's response to decide how they get to feel. To build a relationship with myself is to become emotionally inhabitable. A place where truth can live. A place where tenderness does not require self-erasure. A place where disappointment can be felt without becoming a verdict on my worth. A place where I am allowed to have limits, needs, complexity, contradictions, and desire without being cast out from my own regard. That does not happen in one moment. It happens through repetition. Through 100 small acts of return. Through choosing to stay in contact with myself even when old patterns offer easier exits. Through becoming the kind of woman who, when she says I am here, means it. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of all. A relationship with myself is built when my own presence becomes something I can finally rely on. The foundational practices that help me come back to myself. There comes a point when insight is no longer enough. I can understand my patterns, name my wounds, recognize the moments I leave myself, and still find that when life becomes emotionally difficult, I slip right back into the same old places. That is because understanding alone does not hold me. Awareness can illuminate the door, but it does not always teach me how to walk through it. If I want to come back to myself in a way that lasts, I need practices. Not glamorous ones. Not punishing ones. Not the kind designed to make my life look impressive from the outside. I need practices that are steady enough to meet me in an ordinary life, in a grown woman's life, in a life that is often full before I even get a say in it. That is what foundational practices really are. They are not tricks. They are not accessories to healing. They are forms of return. They are the structures that keep me from becoming emotionally homeless in my own days. I think many women make the mistake of waiting until they feel better to begin caring for themselves well. But by the time I feel emotionally flooded, lonely, activated, or quietly unmoored, I am already farther from myself than I realize. The practices that help me come back are not meant to rescue me only in crisis. They are meant to keep me in conversation with myself before the crisis takes over the room. They are a way of telling my nervous system, again and again, I do not only turn toward myself when things fall apart. I belong to myself in the ordinary hours too. The first thing that changes everything is how I begin the day. Morning has a quality to it that the rest of the day rarely offers. There is a small opening there, a fragile threshold before the world starts pulling on me. If I lose that threshold too quickly, I spend the day trying to recover a sense of center I never really protected in the first place. So one of the most foundational practices is not dramatic at all. It is simply that I try to meet myself before I meet the world. That may mean I sit with coffee in silence for 10 minutes before touching my phone. It may mean I write a few honest lines in a notebook, not because I am trying to produce wisdom, but because I need to hear my own inner climate before everyone else's weather enters me. It may mean I step outside and let the morning air touch my face before I let notifications touch my nervous system. Sometimes it is a page of reading that steadies me. Sometimes it is prayer. Sometimes it is saying one true sentence out loud in the kitchen while the light is still soft. This is how I feel today. This is what I need. This is what I do not want to abandon. That kind of daily mental grounding matters because my mind is not neutral terrain. If I do not gently guide it, it will go where it has always gone under pressure. It will go outward. It will go toward fear, prediction, interpretation, urgency, old narratives, the emotional weather of other people. So I need something that returns me to my own interior before the day begins making claims on me. Another practice that matters just as much is movement, but not movement in the punishing way women are often taught to think about it. I do not mean using my body as a project or a problem to solve. I mean remembering that my body is where I live, and if I am trying to build a relationship with myself, I cannot do it while treating my body like a reluctant machine. An anxiously attached mind can become trapped in loops of thought, but movement gives those thoughts somewhere else to go. It changes the current. It interrupts the internal circling. It reminds me I have a body, not just a story. Some days that means a long walk while the neighborhood is still waking up. Some days it means stretching on the living room floor after dinner because I can feel how much tension I have carried in silence. Some days it means strength training, because there is something honest about feeling my own physical power in a season when I have been emotionally fragile. Some days it means swimming, yoga, gardening, dancing in the kitchen while no one is watching, or taking the scenic route through a park instead of the shortest path home. The point is not performance. The point is contact. I want movement that says I have not abandoned this body just because my mind is busy. Food and rest belong here too, though women are often encouraged to treat them as afterthoughts unless they become problems. But I have come to believe that nourishment is one of the most intimate languages of self-relationship. A woman who is emotionally activated can forget she is hungry. A woman who has spent years attending to everyone else can override fatigue until exhaustion starts speaking for her. A woman who is anxiously attached can believe the real issue is relational, when in truth her system is underfed, underslept, overstimulated, and quietly begging for care. There are moments when what I need most is not more analysis. It is eggs on a plate, water, a warm shower, clean clothes, a good dinner with protein and something green, magnesium before bed, the lights turned low, a decision not to have the conversation tonight because my body is no longer a trustworthy place for clarity. These things sound simple, almost insultingly simple, until I remember how often women are expected to function beautifully while profoundly disconnected from their own physical needs. To come back to myself, I have to stop treating the body as separate from the emotional life. The body is not an accessory to healing. It is where healing lands. Then there is the matter of meaning, which becomes more important the older I get. It is very difficult to remain rooted in myself if I have nothing in my life that belongs to me beyond being wanted, needed, or depended on. One of the deepest stabilizers for a woman is some form of meaningful direction. Not necessarily ambition in the loud, cultural sense. Not a race to prove I matter. But something that engages my spirit beyond my relational anxieties. Something that reminds me I have a life, not just a longing. That could be work I care about. It could be art. It could be volunteering. It could be mentoring younger women, taking a writing class, tending a garden, learning a language, restoring an old room in my house, joining a choir, studying theology, taking photographs, starting a small project I have delayed for years, or simply returning to a part of myself that went quiet while I was busy surviving. Meaning does not have to be grand to be protective. It just has to be real enough to call me back into my own life when I start shrinking around someone else's presence or absence. I also think many women underestimate the importance of emotional housekeeping. I use that phrase because some emotions do not need solving as much as they need tending. A home can look lovely and still collect dust in corners no one sees. The inner life is no different. If I never clear emotional residue, if I never make room to grieve, process, rest, and reset, then I start moving through life with an invisible build-up. Everything touches me faster. Every disappointment lands harder. Every silence becomes louder. Emotional housekeeping might mean turning off the television for one night and sitting in enough quiet to hear what is underneath my irritability. It might mean taking a break from content that leaves me subtly agitated. It might mean no longer exposing myself to conversations that always leave me feeling dimmer. It might mean writing down what I am carrying instead of pretending I am simply tired. It might mean letting myself grieve a version of life I thought I would have by now. Many women are not only anxious. They are full. Full of unshed tears, unfinished endings, old anger, old loyalty, old disappointment. If I do not make space for those things, they will keep speaking through whatever is closest at hand. There are also smaller rituals that become sacred because they are repeatable. I think a woman needs ways to return to herself that do not require a perfect mood or a free afternoon. 10-minute rituals matter more than we think. The cup of tea in a quiet mug. The candle lit before dusk. The playlist that settles my system. The short walk after dinner. The page in a notebook titled What I Know When I Am Calm. The museum visit on a Sunday morning. The weekly breakfast alone where I do not bring work, only my own company. These are not indulgences. They are ways of telling myself that I am not only worthy of care after I have earned collapse. There is one more thing that belongs among foundational practices, and that is reducing unnecessary noise. So many women live with constant input and then wonder why they cannot hear themselves. Music, podcasts, news, texts, social feeds, calls, screens, background chatter, obligations layered on obligations. I am not saying a woman must live in silence to know herself. I am saying she needs enough space to notice when her own inner voice has gone faint. Sometimes coming back to myself is less about adding one more healing habit and more about removing what keeps me from sensing anything true. The practices that help me come back to myself are not meant to impress anyone. That may be why they work. They are humble, repetitive, quiet. They do not promise transformation in a weekend. They simply create the conditions where I can hear myself before fear gets there first. They build familiarity. They create rhythm. They make it harder for me to become a stranger to my own needs. And maybe that is the real purpose of a foundational practice. Not perfection. Not mastery. Not becoming a woman who is never affected. But becoming a woman who, when life pulls her outward, knows how to find her way back with gentleness and with structure. A woman whose return to herself is no longer accidental. A woman who has made coming home a way of life. How I become my own safe space when I'm triggered. A trigger does not arrive politely. It does not knock and wait for me to gather myself. It enters fast. Sometimes through a sentence. Sometimes through a silence. Sometimes through a look, a delayed response, a cancelled plan, a shift in tone so small another person might not even notice it. But my body notices. My body notices before my mind has formed a clean thought, and by the time I realize what is happening, something in me has already left the room and started running. That is what being triggered often feels like in a grown woman's life. Not always visible chaos, but instant internal displacement. I may still be standing at the kitchen counter, folding towels, rinsing a wine glass, driving home from dinner, sitting in a meeting, smiling through a conversation. From the outside, nothing dramatic has happened. But inside, the emotional floor has moved. My chest tightens. My breathing changes. My mind starts reaching. Suddenly I am no longer in the moment I am in. I am in the story I am afraid this moment means. That is the threshold where everything I have practiced either begins to hold me or disappears. Because when I am triggered, my first instinct is rarely to stay with myself. My first instinct is to go toward the source of distress. I want to understand it, solve it, reverse it, soften it, outrun it, fix it before it becomes final. I want the text, the explanation, the reassurance, the warmth, the sign that tells me I can stop bracing. Even when I do not physically reach out, some part of me leans hard in that direction. My attention goes there. My energy goes there. My nervous system acts as though the only way to feel safe again is to get closer to the thing that made me feel unsafe. That impulse is deeply human. It is not pathetic. It is not weakness. It is the old logic of attachment, the old hope that if I can restore connection quickly enough, I can restore peace. But that logic is precisely what keeps many women trapped in cycles that exhaust them. Because the truth is painful and liberating at the same time, the source of my activation is not always the place where my regulation will be found. That is the shift I have to make when I am triggered. Not a glamorous shift. A quiet and almost invisible one. I have to turn toward myself before I turn toward the story. That sounds simple until I am in the moment. In the moment, it can feel almost unnatural. Every part of me wants movement, interpretation, contact, action. Even my thoughts can feel like they are sprinting ahead of me, building meaning at a speed that leaves no room for tenderness or truth. This means he is pulling away. This means I should have been quieter. This means I asked for too much. This means I misread everything. This means I am back in the same old place again. But being my own safe space begins in that exact moment, with one deeply adult decision. I do not have to let the first story become the final reality. I have to pause long enough to realize that what is happening in me is not just emotional. It is physiological. My body is reacting to perceived danger. And a body in perceived danger does not tell the truth cleanly. It tells the truth mixed with memory, fear, old association, and unfinished pain. That does not mean my feelings are fake. It means they are charged. It means they need to be met before they can be interpreted well. So the first thing I try to do when I am triggered is interrupt the chase. Not forever. Just enough. I do not send the second text. I do not reread the conversation 20 times. I do not open social media to look for clues. I do not start collecting evidence for my worst fear. I do not recruit 5 friends into the panic so I can hear my fear echoed back to me in new voices. I do not make the night smaller by letting one emotional rupture become the whole horizon. This interruption is not punishment. It is protection. It is the first act of self-loyalty in a moment that wants to pull me outward. Then I name what is happening as plainly as I can. I am activated. I feel unsafe. I am not in a neutral state. Something old is moving through something current. Sometimes that sentence alone can soften the panic because it reminds me I am not trapped inside reality itself, I am inside a reaction to reality. And reactions, however intense, are not always accurate narrators. After that, I have to bring the body back enough for the mind to become trustworthy again. This is where women often underestimate the sacredness of simple things. A glass of water. Bare feet on the floor. Cold water on my wrists. A shower. Stepping outside into air that feels different from the room where I started spiraling. Changing clothes. Unclenching my jaw. Putting one hand on my chest, one on my stomach, and breathing not because it is some magical cure, but because breath reminds the body it has not actually fallen off the edge of the earth. There are moments when candlelight helps more than analysis. Moments when tea in a quiet kitchen does more for me than one more round of mental interrogation. Moments when sitting on the edge of the bed in clean clothes and doing absolutely nothing for 10 minutes is the bravest thing I can do because it means I am not letting panic drag me by the wrist. This is what many women miss. Being my own safe space does not mean I immediately stop hurting. It means I stop abandoning myself in the hurt. That is a very different thing. I may still feel disappointed. I may still feel scared. I may still feel the ache of wanting someone to come soothe what they stirred. But I no longer hand my whole inner life over to that ache. Part of becoming my own safe space is learning to separate loneliness from dysregulation. They can feel similar, but they are not the same. Loneliness says I want connection. Dysregulation says I want relief. When I am triggered, I often confuse the two. I think what I need is the person. What I may actually need is steadiness. And those are not always found in the same place. There are moments when reaching for a wise and steady friend helps. But the quality of that reaching matters. I am not looking for someone to inflame the story, deepen the obsession, or hand me more reasons to chase. I want the kind of presence that helps me come back into my own body. The kind that reminds me what is real without dismissing what hurts. Sometimes one grounded voice can help me step back from the cliff edge of my own reaction. But even then, the goal is not dependence. The goal is reorientation. And often, after the first wave passes, the deeper work begins. I have to return to facts. Not interpretations. Facts. What actually happened? What was actually said? What do I know for certain, and what have I layered on top of it because uncertainty feels unbearable? This part matters because a triggered mind fills empty spaces with fear. It turns absence into rejection, ambiguity into certainty, silence into verdict. Returning to facts does not erase pain, but it keeps imagination from becoming authority. Then comes the more intimate question: what do I need right now that would actually be kind to me? Not what would make me feel temporarily chosen. Not what would give me the quickest hit of relief. What would be kind? Maybe I need food because my body is making everything louder through exhaustion. Maybe I need to cry without turning the tears into a thesis. Maybe I need to write the message I want to send and not send it yet. Maybe I need to turn off every source of input and sit in one room until my breathing comes back down. Maybe I need to sleep before making meaning out of anything. Maybe I need to put my phone in another room and let the night be ugly and unfinished without trying to force closure out of it. This is where dignity enters. Dignity is not coldness. It is not pretending I do not care. It is not becoming above human need. Dignity is the decision to remain in respectful contact with myself even while I am undone. It is the refusal to let panic turn me into someone who betrays her own depth for a scrap of immediate comfort. It is remembering that I can be tender and still not chase. I can ache and still not beg. I can want someone and still wait until I am regulated enough to know what I actually want to say. There is also something very grown about allowing the moment to remain unresolved. This may be one of the hardest practices of all. When I am triggered, I want an ending. I want a conclusion. I want to know where I stand, what it means, what comes next. But sometimes being my own safe space means I let the moment stay unfinished for the night. I do not force clarity out of fear. I do not demand certainty from a body that needs rest more than answers. I let there be space between the trigger and the response. That space is not emptiness. It is self-respect. And over time, something changes in that space. I begin to trust that I can survive my own activation without immediately outsourcing the rescue. I begin to learn that the first wave will crest and pass. I begin to feel the difference between what my frightened self wants and what my grounded self knows. I begin to understand that safety is not always the same thing as reassurance. Sometimes safety is simply my own refusal to leave. That may be the deepest shift of all. Not that I stop getting triggered. I may still get triggered. I may still feel the familiar rush of fear, the tightening in the chest, the old ache that wants to turn one moment into a prophecy. But I do not disappear so quickly anymore. I know how to sit beside myself in the dark without immediately running toward the nearest light, even if that light is unstable, misleading, or far away. That is what it means to become my own safe space when I am triggered. Not that I become invulnerable. Not that I always get it right. But that I stop making my first response an act of self-abandonment. I pause. I breathe. I return. I let the body come back. I let the mind slow down. I let the night hold what it is holding without forcing myself to solve it while I am still shaking. And in that pause, something sacred begins to form. Not control. Not perfection. Trust. Midlife self-relationship. What changes after 35? After 35, the question of self-relationship changes shape. It is no longer abstract. It is no longer something I can keep safely tucked inside a journal prompt or a passing moment of self-reflection. By this age, life has usually stripped away enough illusion that the distance between who I appear to be and how I actually feel becomes harder to ignore. In younger years, it is still possible to outrun certain truths with momentum. There is often more noise, more striving, more identity built around becoming. I can hide inside ambition, romance, beauty, productivity, motherhood, partnership, reinvention, or the simple velocity of having too much ahead of me to slow down and ask whether I feel deeply at home in my own life. But after 35, something changes. Not for every woman in the same way, not on the same timeline, but enough that many of us recognize the shift when it comes. The old distractions do not work as well. The old roles do not fit as seamlessly. The old performances begin to feel expensive. That is why self-relationship in midlife carries a different emotional weight. I am not only working with desire anymore. I am working with memory. I am working with what life has already done to me, what I have already chosen, what I have already lost, what I stayed in too long, what I left too late, what I tolerated because I was trying to be good, what I carried because there was no one else to carry it. By this point, I usually know something about grief. I know something about disappointment. I know something about the ache of watching a version of life I once believed in become more complicated than I imagined. That history changes the way I relate to myself. Because now, when I lose myself, it is not only about one moment or one relationship. It is often tied to a much deeper fatigue. The fatigue of having spent years performing competence while neglecting inner truth. The fatigue of being needed by many people and still feeling strangely untouched in the places that matter most. The fatigue of carrying responsibility so well that no one notices the private erosion. Midlife has a way of making that erosion visible. Not because life becomes easier, but because the soul grows less willing to be managed. And that is what I think many women feel after 35, even if they do not always say it aloud. A growing intolerance for what used to be survivable. The marriage I once called fine may now feel unbearably quiet. The friendship I kept maintaining may begin to feel one-sided in a way I can no longer soften with excuses. The role I played so beautifully may start to feel like a costume I am too tired to wear. The body I negotiated with for years may begin asking for a different kind of honesty. The loneliness I once buried under productivity may start rising in the middle of an otherwise normal day. This is not failure. It is not instability. It is not proof that I have become ungrateful or dramatic. It is often a sign that something in me is becoming less willing to live on emotional leftovers. That shift can feel unsettling because midlife does not only bring clarity, it also brings fear. There is a particular kind of fear that can surface after 35, especially in women who have lived through betrayal, divorce, emotional neglect, or years of quiet self-abandonment. It is not just the fear of being hurt. It is the fear of time. The fear of starting over. The fear that I have already invested too much in the wrong things. The fear that if I leave what is half alive, there may be nothing waiting for me on the other side except solitude, uncertainty, and a version of myself I no longer know how to trust. There is fear that I have missed something. Fear that I should be farther along emotionally. Fear that everyone else has found the peace I still seem to be searching for in private. That fear has power because by midlife, pain is rarely theoretical. I know what it costs to rebuild. I know what it feels like to survive a season I never wanted. I know what it is to wake up and realize my life must now be lived from a place I did not choose. So if I settle, I do not always settle because I do not know better. Sometimes I settle because I know exactly how much courage it takes to begin again. This is why anxious attachment can become even more layered in midlife. It is no longer only about longing for love or fearing disconnection. It can also become entangled with grief, time, and self-worth in a culture that often makes women feel less visible as they age. The body changes. Energy changes. Desire changes. Hormones shift. Sleep becomes less dependable. The mirror may begin reflecting a woman whose face carries more life in it than the culture knows how to honor. And if I have not built a strong relationship with myself, those changes can make me more vulnerable to looking outward for reassurance that I still matter. That can show up in subtle ways. I may become more affected by romantic inconsistency because it touches not only old attachment wounds, but fears about desirability. I may overstay in emotionally thin relationships because being chosen feels safer than facing the vastness of my own unmet life. I may find myself grieving not just the ending of a relationship, but the ending of the woman I thought I would be by now. There is real sorrow in that. The woman who thought she would have a more peaceful marriage by this age. The woman who thought she would feel more secure in her body. The woman who thought she would be less lonely after all these years of trying to do life well. The woman who thought being strong would eventually make life feel safer. The woman who gave her best years to people, roles, systems, or expectations that never truly held her the way she needed. Midlife often asks me to grieve those women while also becoming someone new. That is no small task. And then there are the role changes that can quietly destabilize identity. Children grow up. Parents age. Careers plateau or disappoint. Marriages shift into companionship or distance or silence. The home changes. The body changes. The things that once organized my sense of self begin moving, and suddenly I am left with questions I had been postponing for years. Who am I when I am no longer needed in the same way? Who am I when the role that gave me structure no longer gives me meaning? Who am I when my body asks for tenderness instead of discipline? Who am I when I can no longer pretend that endurance is the same thing as peace? Who am I when I stop performing the version of womanhood that made everyone else comfortable? Those are midlife questions. And they do not have quick answers. But they do have emotional honesty in them. More honesty, often, than anything I was willing to face in earlier years. That is why I do not see this season as a decline. I see it as a confrontation with truth. A confrontation that can feel brutal at first because truth tends to remove the padding. It asks whether I want to keep living from roles, habits, and emotional agreements that no longer fit the woman I have become. The answer may not come all at once. In fact, it rarely does. It often comes in flashes. In the way I feel after a conversation. In the heaviness that settles after another holiday where everyone played their part but no one said what mattered. In the strange sadness that follows a social gathering I should have enjoyed. In the body's refusal to keep pretending. In the tears that come when I finally stop calling a lonely life busy. In the moment I realize I have spent years being admired for qualities that were often built on self-erasure. That realization can feel devastating. But it can also be holy. Because once I see how much of my life has been organized around adaptation, performance, duty, or fear, I can no longer pretend self-relationship is optional. After 35, it becomes survival of a different kind. Not the survival of pleasing, managing, enduring, proving, or carrying. The survival of finally becoming real to myself. And that reality is often quieter than people imagine. It does not always announce itself through dramatic reinvention. Sometimes it looks like a woman becoming less willing to force what does not fit. Less willing to romanticize confusion. Less willing to overfunction in the name of love. Less willing to keep translating her pain into acceptable language. It looks like discernment deepening. It looks like a stronger boundary around what enters her life and what gets to stay. It looks like a woman caring less about appearing good and more about being internally true. That is what changes after 35. Not just the body. Not just the circumstances. The threshold for self-betrayal. I begin to feel it sooner. I begin to question it more honestly. I begin to understand that what once looked like strength may have also been disconnection. I begin to see that not every role I played was rooted in truth. I begin to sense that if I do not come closer to myself now, the second half of my life may be built on the same quiet absences as the first. And that is what makes this season so tender and so powerful at once. Midlife does not only expose what is unresolved. It also offers me a different kind of belonging. Not the belonging that comes from being chosen by everyone else, but the belonging that comes from finally refusing to live estranged from myself. That is the invitation hidden inside this age. Not to become younger again. Not to become better packaged. Not to become untouched by history. But to become more deeply inhabited by my own truth. What a real relationship with myself looks like in daily life. A real relationship with myself is not something I feel only in profound moments. It is not reserved for breakthroughs, long journal entries, quiet weekends away, or those rare evenings when I suddenly become wise enough to hear my own soul clearly. If it is real, it has to live in ordinary life. It has to exist on the kind of Tuesday when nothing dramatic happens and I still have to decide whether I will remain loyal to myself in the smallest ways. That is where the truth of it shows. Not in what I say I believe about myself, but in how I move through a normal day when no one is applauding, when no one is watching closely, when I am simply left with my own choices, my own habits, my own impulses, and my own inner voice. A real relationship with myself begins to reveal itself in the pause before I react. It shows up when something unsettles me and I do not immediately hand my attention over to panic. I still feel things, often deeply. I still notice shifts. I still experience disappointment, longing, irritation, uncertainty. But I no longer obey every emotion the moment it arrives. There is a little more space now. A little more breath. A little more ability to say to myself, something in me is stirred, but I do not have to become that stirring. That changes the texture of daily life more than most people realize. It means I stop checking my phone like it contains a verdict about my worth. I may still look. I am still human. But the energy is different. I do not approach every notification like it might save or ruin my evening. I begin to notice when I am reaching for contact not because I have something genuine to say, but because I want relief from uncertainty. And instead of moving automatically, I can pause long enough to ask what I actually need. Sometimes what I need is not another message. Sometimes what I need is dinner. Or sleep. Or 10 minutes without input. Or the honesty to admit that I feel lonely, not unloved. Or the humility to recognize that my body is tired and everything is louder because of it. This is one of the first visible differences in a woman who has a relationship with herself. She does not let every discomfort become a drama about meaning. She learns how to tend to the moment before turning it into a story. That also changes how I communicate. I become less performative, less crowded in my language, less desperate to be perfectly understood at any cost. I stop over-explaining as though clarity requires a defense. I stop padding every truth with so much softness that the truth disappears. I stop speaking from the part of me that is still trying to manage how I will be received. Instead, I begin to speak from a steadier place, where honesty matters more than approval. That does not make me harsh. It makes me cleaner. I can say that did not sit well with me. I can say I need more clarity than this. I can say I need time to think. I can say I cannot do that tonight. I can say that dynamic no longer works for me. I can say nothing at all when silence is the more self-respecting choice. A relationship with myself gives me access to clean language because I am no longer constantly translating my needs into forms that will be easiest for everyone else to swallow. I am still thoughtful. I am still kind. But I am less willing to disappear inside politeness. It changes my mornings too. I begin the day with more intention, not in a rigid way, but in a way that reflects self-respect. I do not want my first experience of consciousness to be emotional dependency on the outside world. So I create even the smallest gap between waking and being claimed. That gap might hold coffee, silence, prayer, stretching, a few lines in a notebook, a walk, the sight of early light coming through the kitchen window. It does not have to be beautiful in a cinematic way. It simply has to belong to me. That belonging matters. Because a woman with a real relationship to herself stops giving away every threshold of the day. She notices that the way she enters the morning affects how easily she can hear herself by noon. My choices in relationships begin to change as well, though often in subtle ways before dramatic ones. I stop being as impressed by intensity. I become more interested in coherence. I pay attention not only to attraction, but to steadiness. Not only to chemistry, but to how my body feels after I leave. Do I feel expanded, settled, more myself? Or do I feel preoccupied, diminished, energized in a way that is really just activated? That distinction becomes crucial. A woman with a real relationship to herself may still desire deeply, may still feel drawn toward complicated people, may still have old wounds stirred by familiar dynamics. But she becomes harder to keep in confusion for long. She notices sooner when she is romanticizing inconsistency. She notices sooner when she is making excuses for something her body already experiences as costly. She notices sooner when she is giving too much interpretive generosity to what is actually a lack of care. That does not mean she never makes mistakes. It means she recovers herself faster. And that recovery time changes everything. In friendship, I become more discerning too. I begin to recognize the difference between history and nourishment. There are people I have loved for years who may no longer feel good to my spirit. Not because they are terrible, but because I am no longer willing to call depletion connection simply because it is familiar. I start paying attention to how I feel after being with someone. Not just whether we had fun, but whether I feel more alive, more honest, more settled in myself, or somehow more scattered, more diminished, more emotionally responsible than I should be. This kind of discernment can feel almost radical for women who were taught that being a good person meant being endlessly available. But a relationship with myself teaches me that availability without discernment is not virtue. It is leakage. So I choose differently. I may spend less time in rooms where I feel invisible. I may prefer one steady friend over a louder circle. I may leave earlier. I may share less with people who have not shown they can hold what is true. I may protect my peace with a tenderness that would once have felt selfish to me. At home, this relationship becomes visible in the atmosphere I create around myself. I begin to care about my evenings, not because I am performing wellness, but because I am starting to understand that the way I end a day matters. I make dinner instead of grazing over the sink while I scroll. I light a candle not because candles fix loneliness, but because beauty can help me stay present. I put on music that settles me rather than noise that numbs me. I fold the blanket over my legs and let myself rest without calling it laziness. I stop treating rest as something I must earn through near exhaustion. These things can look insignificant from the outside. They are not. They are evidence that I am no longer living as though my own comfort is an afterthought. A real relationship with myself also changes how I carry disappointment. This may be one of the most profound shifts of all. I still get disappointed. I still get hurt. I still have moments when someone's distance, inconsistency, or inability to meet me lands in the old places. But the disappointment no longer becomes an eviction from myself. I do not have to turn every hurt into self-doubt. I do not have to make every letdown mean I should have been less needy, less open, less hopeful, less human. I can feel the pain and still remain on my own side. That is a different kind of strength than endurance. It means I can grieve without making grief my identity. I can miss someone without turning the missing into a reason to betray my own standards. I can want love and still refuse confusion. I can be lonely and still not return to what empties me. I can ache and still make dinner, take a shower, go for a walk, call a wise friend, read a few pages, and sleep in clean sheets. I can remain in my own life even while my heart is tender. There is something sacred about that. Something deeply adult. Because daily life is where love of self either becomes real or remains a concept. It is in the meals, the texts, the pauses, the spending, the choices about who gets access, the way I speak to myself after a hard conversation, the way I recover from a bad day, the way I hold my body when I am tired, the way I stop myself from making one painful moment the center of the whole story. Even silence changes. Silence becomes less threatening when I have a relationship with myself. Not always comfortable, not always easy, but less hostile. I can sit in a quiet room and not feel the immediate need to fill it with someone else's voice. I can drive without always needing noise. I can let the evening be simple. I can let a Sunday afternoon stretch without forcing it to prove something. That is not emptiness. It is a form of intimacy. And perhaps that is what a real relationship with myself looks like most of all in daily life. I stop treating myself like someone I meet only in emergencies. I become familiar to myself. I become less startled by my own feelings. Less avoidant of my own truths. Less willing to hand myself over to every fear that passes through. I begin to live as though my inner life is not a burden to manage, but a home to tend. That is a quiet transformation. It may not look dramatic from the outside. But inside a woman's life, it changes the emotional climate of everything. The woman I become when I stop leaving myself. When I stop leaving myself, I do not become a different woman overnight. I become more fully inhabited. That is the change. Not a reinvention polished enough for other people to admire. Not a dramatic before and after story that makes pain look tidy. Not some perfected version of womanhood where I no longer feel deeply, no longer get triggered, no longer want love, no longer grieve, no longer ache. The real transformation is quieter than that, and in some ways far more sacred. I become a woman who stays. For many years, perhaps most of my life, staying with myself was not my first instinct. My first instinct was management, adaptation, interpretation, pleasing, endurance, numbing, trying harder, softening the truth, making sense of someone else before making contact with myself. I knew how to survive discomfort by moving away from my own center. I knew how to look composed while quietly abandoning the parts of me that were tired, hurt, uncertain, or hungry for something more honest. So when I stop leaving myself, the first thing that changes is not my life on the outside. It is the quality of my inner presence. I am no longer so quick to disappear when something hurts. I do not instantly turn against myself. I do not hand my worth over to a difficult conversation, a distant tone, a lonely night, or a relationship that cannot meet me where I live. I feel what I feel, but I remain. That kind of remaining alters a woman from the inside out. It makes me less available for confusion disguised as romance. Less willing to call emotional instability passion. Less likely to confuse longing with alignment. Less likely to call myself needy for wanting reciprocity. Less likely to keep trying to earn what should have come with peace attached to it. When I stop leaving myself, I begin to recognize that the life I want cannot be built on repeated acts of self-betrayal. That realization sounds obvious when said aloud, but it lands differently when I have lived the opposite for years. When I have spent enough time abandoning my instincts to preserve connection, enough time overriding my body to remain desirable, enough time silencing my needs to keep the atmosphere calm, enough time calling endurance strength simply because I had no other language for it, the return to myself feels almost like grief before it feels like freedom. Because I have to mourn the woman who thought disappearing was the price of being loved well. I have to mourn how often she negotiated against her own peace. How often she stayed longer than her spirit could bear. How often she tried to become easier instead of asking why love required so much shrinking. How often she doubted what she knew because someone else's comfort seemed more urgent than her own truth. How often she thought if she could just be wise enough, beautiful enough, patient enough, calm enough, spiritual enough, understanding enough, then maybe she would finally arrive at a kind of safety that did not keep moving every time someone else changed. There is heartbreak in that recognition. But there is also tenderness. Because I do not want to judge the woman I had to be. She was trying to survive with the tools she had. She was trying to hold closeness together in the ways she had learned. She was trying to be loved without being left. And perhaps no one ever taught her that love that requires her disappearance is not love she can rest inside. So I meet her with compassion. And then I let her grow. The woman I become when I stop leaving myself is not colder. She is not less loving. She is not detached in the brittle sense. She is softer in cleaner ways. More honest. More internally gathered. She feels less like someone performing strength and more like someone living from a center that does not vanish the moment life becomes emotionally difficult. That means she may disappoint more people. Quietly, respectfully, but truly. Because once I stop leaving myself, I can no longer remain endlessly available to what drains me. I can no longer keep saying yes from fear and calling it kindness. I can no longer make my body absorb what my mouth refuses to say. I can no longer offer loyalty to roles, patterns, and relationships that cost me too much internally just because they are familiar. This does not make me selfish. It makes me loyal in a different direction. Self-loyalty is one of the deepest changes that happens when I stop leaving myself. I begin to understand that my own inner life is not something to negotiate away for the sake of being easier to keep. I stop treating my emotional reality like an inconvenience that should be managed privately so everyone else can remain comfortable. I stop making my own needs sound unreasonable in my own mind. I stop speaking to myself in the language of dismissal. That shift is subtle and enormous at once. It means when I am tired, I believe the tiredness instead of moralizing it. When I am hurt, I listen instead of minimizing. When I feel something tightening in my body, I get curious before I get critical. When a relationship begins asking me to override myself too often, I notice. When a room makes me feel smaller, I do not insist on staying just to prove I am easygoing. When an old attachment wound flares, I no longer assume it should make all my choices for me. The woman I become is not untouched by pain. She is simply less ruled by it. That distinction matters. Because many women imagine healing as a state where nothing hurts anymore. But that is not the kind of woman I trust. I trust the woman who still feels deeply and remains on her own side. The woman who can be disappointed without collapsing into self-doubt. The woman who can long for love without treating longing as an emergency. The woman who can be lonely and still not go back to what empties her. The woman who can grieve a loss without turning the loss into a verdict about her worth. That woman has gravity. She no longer mistakes every emotional wave for a command. She no longer believes fear deserves the final word. She no longer interprets another person's inconsistency as proof that she should become smaller, quieter, prettier, easier, more forgiving, less human. She knows what it costs to abandon herself, and because she knows, she becomes slower to do it. And that slowness is a form of wisdom. When I stop leaving myself, I also become more peaceful in ways that may not look impressive to the outside world. I become less hungry for stimulation that only covers emptiness. Less interested in being wanted by people who do not know how to hold depth. Less available for drama that keeps my nervous system busy but my soul underfed. I begin to crave what is real, what is clean, what is mutual, what is calm enough for me to hear myself inside it. That changes how I love. It changes what I tolerate. It changes the kind of conversations I am willing to have. It changes what I call chemistry. It changes what I call enough. It changes what I am willing to sacrifice in order to remain chosen. And maybe most beautifully, it changes my relationship with solitude. When I was still leaving myself, solitude could feel like exposure. Too much room for fear, too much silence, too much contact with all the things I had worked so hard to outrun. But when I begin staying with myself, solitude slowly becomes less hostile. Not always easy, not always serene, but less punishing. It becomes a place where I can hear my own life more clearly. A place where I can feel grief, beauty, exhaustion, memory, desire, and truth without immediately turning away. That is not emptiness. That is intimacy. I think many women underestimate how miraculous it is to become emotionally inhabitable to themselves. To become a place where they can land. A place where they do not have to perform for admission. A place where mess does not mean exile. A place where they can be uncertain without being abandoned, tender without being ridiculed, disappointed without being erased, aging without being diminished, complex without being made wrong. That is the woman I become when I stop leaving myself. Not perfect. Not finished. Not beyond longing. Not beyond heartbreak. Not beyond the ordinary ache of being human. But no longer so estranged from my own inner world. No longer so quick to run. no longer so easy to remove from my own life. There is a quiet dignity in that. Not the dignity of appearing polished, but the dignity of being deeply accompanied by my own presence. Of knowing that even when life is unresolved, even when a relationship is uncertain, even when grief comes back in familiar waves, even when the future feels less clear than I want it to, I still have somewhere to stand. I have myself. Not as a slogan. Not as a consolation prize. As a living relationship. And perhaps that is the ending this whole journey has been moving toward. Not a perfect life. Not a life without attachment, risk, love, or pain. But a life where I no longer disappear so easily inside those things. A life where I can remain present to my own truth while loving, while hoping, while aging, while grieving, while becoming. A life where I stop asking, will someone finally stay with me the way I need? And begin answering, more and more honestly, I will. What this whole story reveals is not the collapse of a woman, but the slow, almost invisible distance that can grow between a woman and her own inner life. On the outside, she can still look capable, thoughtful, responsible, and emotionally composed. She can still go to work, show up for the people she loves, keep the house running, answer messages, make practical decisions, and carry herself with dignity. But underneath that functioning exterior, another story can be unfolding. She may be reading every shift in tone, feeling unsafe inside uncertainty, over-adapting to keep connection, and quietly abandoning herself in dozens of ways that no one around her fully sees. Her pain is not always dramatic. It is often refined, hidden, and woven into daily life. It lives in overthinking, in pleasing, in staying too long, in calling endurance love, in becoming hyper-aware of everyone else while slowly becoming less available to herself. As the story deepens, the truth becomes clearer. She did not lose herself because she was weak. She lost herself through old survival skills that once helped her stay loved, accepted, or emotionally safe. She learned to be the calm one, the understanding one, the dependable one, the woman who could absorb discomfort without making it inconvenient for others. Those patterns followed her into adulthood and shaped the way she loved, the way she tolerated, the way she attached, and the way she interpreted pain. But over time, what once protected her began to cost her. She started to see that real healing was not about becoming cold, perfect, or untouchable. It was about learning how to stay with herself when she felt triggered, lonely, uncertain, disappointed, or emotionally exposed. It was about building a relationship with herself through daily return, honesty, embodiment, boundaries, self-trust, and a deeper refusal to keep betraying what she knew inside. The deepest lesson from her story is this: the most important relationship in my life is not the one that makes me feel chosen in moments of fear, but the one that allows me to remain present to myself in moments of pain. That is the shift. Not chasing reassurance, but becoming someone I can rely on. Not trying to never feel hurt again, but refusing to abandon myself when I do. In real life, this can look very simple. It can mean pausing before reacting. Telling myself the truth sooner. Listening to my body before overriding it. Not making every silence mean rejection. Choosing rest before panic. Choosing clarity over confusion. Choosing a slower, steadier, more honest life over the exhausting performance of always seeming fine. For anyone listening, the question is not whether you have ever felt quietly lost. The question is whether you are ready to stop leaving yourself there. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Here's a small question for you. Are you more likely to lose yourself through A. Overthinking and emotional monitoring, or B. Staying strong and pretending I'm fine? Comment A or B below. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts too. What part of this story felt the most familiar to you? And what do you think it means to truly build a relationship with yourself in this season of your life? Share your perspective in the comments so others can read, reflect, and feel less alone. If this kind of content speaks to you, subscribe to the channel and support it so I can keep creating more honest, meaningful videos like this.